Hello and welcome to Module 13, which is Aquatic Biomes. So there's freshwater and saltwater for aquatic biomes, and the freshwater includes three. So there's streams and rivers, lakes and ponds, and freshwater wetlands. So if we look at the first one, streams and rivers, so the flow rate varies depending on if it's a small little creek or maybe a massive river. But they're usually generally narrow compared to a river. So stream is small compared to a river. It's very oxygenated. So you can see in the top picture, lots of oxygen because the water is constantly turning over. So things like trout and salmon really thrive, and they actually really need that. They need that fast flowing water. So you generally don't see trout and salmon living in stagnant water. So they need that fast flowing water. So we got the brook trout, the salmon that are migrating up the river. We don't see those in areas like Mary Lake, for example. They need very oxygenated water. And then if we look at low oxygenated water, we have really slow flowing rivers. Think of like the Sacramento River and all the little pools of water. You generally don't see trout and salmon in those, but you see catfish and things that kind of dwell on the bottom. Algae grows where there's very slow flowing water. You don't see algae growing in a creek or stream like the picture on the top right. All right, so if we look at lakes and ponds, there's different zones. So these are really important. So I'm going to kind of refer to Mary Lake a little bit and then Whiskeytown. But if we look at Mary Lake has this littoral zone, which is where you have plants, like kind of like the edge. You can think of it like that. And then you've got some plants and things that are coming out of the water a little bit farther from shore. So anywhere where we've got plants that can grow in the bottom, the benthic area, and they're emerging out of the top, that would be our littoral zone. So it varies depending on the water flow. So a lake like Shasta, for example, really doesn't have a very good or if any littoral zone at all, mainly due to the steepness, the traffic. So there's a lot of churning in that lake from boats and things like that. Whereas places like Mary Lake, for example, don't. So there is and it's very shallow, and so we have a bigger littoral zone. And then the next zone is the limnetic zone. So there's a lot of life in a lake that lives in the limnetic zone. So this is where you'd find, like in Shasta, maybe like bass, trout, sunfish, or not sunfish, but bluegills, and things like that. So you would find those in this limnetic zone. And so you have light penetrating through that. So things tend to live where there's light. And then down below, you get this profundal zone. So this is a dark area. Mary Lake generally is not deep enough to have a profundal zone. So their limnetic zone might extend all the way down to the bottom. So profundal zone is where it's dark. So light does not penetrate. And this depends on the lake. So in Whiskeytown Lake, the profundal zone is a lot deeper than it is in Shasta. And that's because there's lots of sediment in Shasta. There's, like I said, with the boats churning up the water. So it causes a lot of suspended sediment, which doesn't allow light to penetrate through. So it'll be a little bit deeper profundal zone in Whiskeytown than Shasta. And then the last zone is the benthic zone. So the benthic zone is basically just the bottom. So you've got the benthic zone extending all the way from basically the shore all the way down to the depths of the profundal zone. And this is for any type of, Mary Lake versus Whiskeytown versus Shasta. It's basically just the bottom is the benthic zone. Another important thing I forgot to mention, in the profundal zone, there's very little oxygen. You don't have anything photosynthesizing. And so generally very low oxygen levels because there's no photosynthetic organisms down there. All right, so for lakes, we generally categorize them based on how good their primary productivity is. So the oligotrophic would be low phosphorus and nitrogen, which are important. Those are limiting factors for plant growth. And so if those are low, then the productivity is going to be very low. So the Great Salt Lake, for example, because of the salinity, is oligotrophic. So there's very little life at all, mainly due to the salt content. Another lake, a good example, I'm trying to think. I can't think of another one, but just something that doesn't have very much productivity. Think of a lake that doesn't have very much life in it. So that'd be oligotrophic, and probably due to maybe high salinity, low phosphorus and nitrogen. That could be due to runoff. That could be due to plants not existing, like in a high saline lake. And then mesotrophic would be an average. So meso kind of in the middle. So this would be kind of an average lake productivity. That would be, I would say, like Shasta, Whiskeytown are both mesotrophic. Eutrophic, I would say this would be Mary Lake. So eutrophic is not necessarily a good thing. So we'll talk a little bit later about eutrophication, and that's basically excess nutrients. So there's too many nutrients, and that could be due to runoff. Like for Mary Lake, most of it is due to runoff. But there's too much phosphorus, too much nitrogen. And so what happens is you get an overabundance of something, like for example, algae. You get too much of that, and that blocks out sunlight to the profundal area. And so you don't get growth down below, but you get this excess algae and growth on the top. And so that can create like red tide. Maybe you've heard of that for the oceans. That's due to excess fertilizer, excess nutrients in the ocean, which actually is a huge problem because, like I said, it blocks out light to things below, like corals that can't move. And so that can be a big problem. So eutrophic is not necessarily a good thing. All right, freshwater wetlands. So the first wetland or the first freshwater biome is the wetland. So this is an area that's partially submerged. There's a lot of emergent vegetation, meaning vegetation that's coming out of the water. And so it's definitely like a very productive area. So wetland is really, really important. You can see in the second bullet, freshwater wetlands are among the most productive biomes on Earth. So they are extremely, extremely important. And we do a lot of preservation in wetlands. So there's a lot of focus on preserving wetlands, keeping them productive, because a lot of times there are nursery areas for a lot of organisms that are extremely important on Earth. So there's a couple different kinds. There's swamps, marshes, and bogs. And so basically the difference, swamps contain trees, marshes don't. So that's kind of how you can tell the difference. And a bog is just a very acidic, kind of stagnant. It's going to stink really bad because things are decomposing and breaking down very slowly. So here is some examples. So thinking about these, which one is out of these three, which one is the swamp? So think about it for a minute. So the swamp would be the top right. And the way I know that is because there's trees. Marshes tend to have cattails, which are these things right here. And then they have kind of non-woody plants. So these are non-woody plants. These are some woody plants. So this is also a marsh, but it's on the verge of a swamp out here. So if water extended, I'm not sure if water extends into these trees. Probably not. I'm thinking it's probably just this area. So this would also be considered a swamp. I'm sorry, a marsh. But a swamp would be this. So a swamp, you can see there's lots of algae growth and there's trees, and that's the biggest difference.
The Everglades is one of the world's most unique ecological treasures. It's not just valuable to Florida, but the entire world. There is diversity in the wildlife here that really can't be found anywhere else. But this beautiful historical land is in danger. Unfortunately, hundreds of years ago, this treasure was not valued as much as it is today.
So going as far back as the 1880s, the system was extensively engineered with a view towards making the land more habitable and to spur economic growth throughout the region. What this has done over the course of time, significant barriers to flow were put up and essentially starved the Everglades of the water that it actually needs.
The native tribes that call this land home has drastically impacted their way of life.
We've been going to Washington like every 3 or 4 months for the past 5 or 6 years. And here, we've been suing them at federal courthouse, the United States courthouse, for the past 20 years. This is nothing new. This goes on and on and on. That's why here you used to have snakes, water snakes, your panthers, your bears, your bobcats, all over. Because when the water's high, they would migrate onto dry land. But they don't exist here no more because they're dead. They don't exist no more because they know better, because they know the water is polluted.
Due to the mass development, the Everglades has become dangerously polluted. Scientists have found high levels of phosphorus and mercury. This is just the beginning of the water problems for the state of Florida.
If you live in Miami or Fort Lauderdale or the Palm Beaches, your drinking water comes from the Everglades. Basically, the water that gets to the Everglades goes down through the limestone rock. It goes into the Biscayne Aquifer. It's only a few hundred feet deep, and it has to be replenished all the time because we're taking water out of there for millions of people. What we're trying to do is all this water we're dumping to the estuaries, the Everglades doesn't have enough water right now. It needs it for its own ecology. It needs it for the Biscayne Aquifer to stay fresh. And so we're trying to put 1 million acre feet of Okeechobee water back into the Everglades, which is going to help the Everglades and make them wet and make them the wonderful wetland paradise that they used to be. It's also going to recharge the aquifers down there. And it's going to be the best thing that we could do for drinking water supply in the future for the lower East Coast. And to see legislators down there saying, oh, we're not sure we like this project. And it's like, guys, we're helping build your water supply future.
We haven't yet had to be victims of the water wars, as they're called, and that folks in northern parts of Florida are seeing, where they're debating about water supply with Georgia and Alabama. And it's because we have this abundant supply that's recharged every year by the Everglades. And if the Everglades was completely drained or totally altered, that supply wouldn't be there anymore, and we'd be needing to find a different source of water supply to use every day. And of course, water is one of the most important things for everyone in their daily lives and in their health and their viability.
For so long, man has used the Everglades to create an economy and for the growth of agricultural and industrial land development. Many are looking for answers on how the Everglades got into the condition it's in.
And knowing the levels of toxins 3 times what they're supposed to be relative to the Water Protection Act and what have you, that big business is certainly a major contributor in this. And it's time to stop blaming the citizens, who have a very small blame in this, and it's time to start looking at the larger interests, who for 80 years have had free reign to use Florida as a big giant septic tank.
If you go down 27, you look to your right, you get to like when you get close to South Bay, you see a whole bunch of field on that side. It was started back when Governor Chris was still in office, to make reservoirs there to clean the water from the polluted sugar cane, from the cattle, from citrus, pump the water there, and then release it. But Governor Chris then worked to deal with the sugar cane, bought about 80,000 acres or something from that company, and just abandoned it.
There's no question that agriculture creates quite a bit of phosphorus pollution. I think that the sugar companies have recognized that over time. I know that their managing practices have changed dramatically. To minimize pollution, I think they've come a long way. So I think we've all learned a lot, and I think the state of Florida has taking a lot of the water that flows through agricultural areas, and now with all these pre-treatment areas, we've come a long way.
But there is hope. With the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan in place, the ultimate goal is to provide the Everglades with clean, fresh water in the right place at the right time.
I think the most important thing is that we stay focused and continue the progress on Everglades restoration. We have a number of projects, such as Tamiami Trail bridging, that will help remove a barrier to sheet flow and allow water to flow naturally. We have projects like the Picayune Strand over in Southwest Florida, where 55,000 acres of habitat that's been used by panthers and other very, very critically endangered wildlife is now being restored, and that project is nearly complete. So we need to make sure we're finishing these things that are underway. but that we're also keeping our eye on what's next to come. What are the next things that we need to make sure we are doing to reconnect the natural flow of the Everglades?
So my viewpoints as a commissioner is that you can't draw lines in the mud out there, and everything's for just one area. You have to keep a global viewpoint of the global Everglades. Otherwise, it's a trickle-down effect of destroying the Everglades over time. There may be minor impacts in different areas for the global benefit, and then we will succeed in saving one of the natural wonders of the whole world.
Always says, clean the water. Do not flush it down the river. Dirty. That's all we're doing. If everybody did their job, this Everglades and this environment would be a whole lot better place. It'd be better for your grandchildren and their children, because pretty soon they're not going to cost you, but maybe a little bottle of water costs you $1. It costs you maybe $10, maybe 10 years from now.
To find out more information on Everglades restoration, or to find out how you could help, visit evergladesplan.org or contact Audubon.
All right. So wetlands, you can see, are extremely important. They take in a vast amount of rainwater and then they slowly trickle it down into the ground. So very, very important. Let me make this big here. So they also filter out pollutants. So they're very, very important in filtering. They take pollutants that are in the ground or in the air, rain, and then by the time it gets down into the groundwater, it's essentially purified, clean water. So they do a huge ecosystem service. So their ecosystem service would be filtering pollutants, slowly releasing rainwater down into the ground so that we can fill the aquifer. You saw how important the Everglades were. The wetlands, which includes the Everglades, makes up about 5% of the U.S. land area, the last bullet there. But half of the freshwaters have been drained in order to produce agriculture. So they're very, very important, and we need to do a better job of preserving. And you can see that the more we understand about environmental science and how the ecosystems are tied together, the better. All right, so for marine biomes, there's 5 main types. And so there's salt, marsh, mangrove swamp, intertidal zone, coral reefs, open ocean. So we'll talk about each one. So salt marsh. So once again, a marsh does not have trees. So a great example of this would be in Eureka. If you've ever been over there, as you come into Arcata and Eureka, you've got the huge marsh there. So that's a salt marsh. And that's really important as well. It's very similar to the freshwater marsh, except for it's salty. And so you've got a huge amount of diversity, and it's a breeding ground for a lot of organisms, just like the freshwater marshes. And it's very, very important as far as productivity. So it's also one of the most productive biomes in the world. All right, so mangrove swamp. So once again, a swamp. So swamp has trees. And these are mangrove trees. And so mangrove trees grow in saltwater. It's a root system. And so they're really important not only to prevent erosion, but they're also really important because they're breeding grounds as well to a lot of fish. They use these areas as protection. And so what's happening around the world is these mangroves not only provide protection for breeding, but they also provide protection for the coastlines. And so when people come in and they build resorts, people don't want to, traipse through the mangroves. So they're removing mangroves in order to have nice views of the ocean, beaches. But what happens is that that prevention of erosion is gone. And so we're seeing a huge amount of beach erosion with mangroves being removed, and also breeding grounds for organisms are disappearing, which is not good. So those are extremely important. And the next one is intertidal zone. So intertidal zone is where you've got our tidal pools. And so you've probably been to the ocean where you've seen the tide goes out. Maybe you've been to Agate Beach. And so there's little pools of organisms that you can see. That's the intertidal zone. And so these also provide some protection for organisms. But that's just this littoral zone. So just like in the freshwater biomes, you've got the littoral zone where you've got organisms that are emergent. So you've got some kelp and things like that that are emergent, and then barnacles stuff. And then as the water comes up, those are submerged. So you can see this intertidal zone here. And that's just this band between high tide and low tide. These organisms dwell and thrive in there. All right, and then coral reefs. Coral reefs are extremely important. So coral reefs, they're one of the Earth's most diverse ecosystems. So along with these, the rainforests would be our terrestrial diversity areas. And so coral reefs are they grow in basically some of our nutrient poor areas, but they're some of the most diverse areas, and they're very, very susceptible to climate change. So if ocean sea levels go up, or down, or there's more intensity of sunlight, or there's more CO2. And remember, oceans provide a good ecosystem service with CO2 storage. So if you have CO2 storage, and let's say you have excess CO2 in the atmosphere, well, then what happens is you get basically more acidification in the ocean, and corals are very, very susceptible. Can't talk. They're very susceptible to any kind of change. So basically, they will bleach. If they don't like it, they bleach. And corals are a combination of zooxanthellae and algae. So they're kind of this symbiotic relationship between the two. And so if something happens, like there's increased CO2, increased acidity, which causes, the pH in the water to change, then the zooxanthellae split. So they're kind of these mobile organisms. The algae is not. So they kind of share this relationship. So they leave. And if they leave, that's what provides nutrients, or the algae is providing nutrients to them. So if something happens and something's not working together, then it doesn't work at all. And so the coral end up bleaching because the algae disappears, or zooxanthellae disappear, and the algae provide color. So they bleach, they get white, and if they're white for too long, they're basically starving. And so the zooxanthellae starve, and then they die. And so that's what coral bleaching is. So small bleaching events, if coral are alive still and they've changed to white, changed color, they can survive for a short period of time, just like something that is starving or not able to eat. But obviously, if something starves for too long, it dies. And that's what we're seeing with the coral reefs, huge bleaching events. Some of them are irreversible. And once they're gone, these coral are thousands of years old. I mean, some of them are insanely old. And they can't just up and move. So if rapid changes are occurring in the ocean, it's causing these big loss of life. And these are our most diverse areas in the ocean. So it's like basically wiping out a rainforest, but in the ocean. And so that's why they're very, very important. All right, so here's kind of what I was talking about with this zooxanthellae. So you can see you've got these polyps and the zooxanthellae working together. Bleaching, the zooxanthellae take off. And then if it takes off for too long, now you've got a dead coral, and you can tell it's dead because there's growth of algae all over it. And so it's not surviving anymore. The Great Barrier Reef is the biggest coral reef in the world, 1,600 square miles. So it's pretty amazing. I put some statistics here. So 400 species of coral live within the Great Barrier Reef, 1,500 species of tropical fish, and 200 species of birds live obviously on the surface, but they thrive on eating those fish that live in that coral reef area. So that's pretty significant. If we wipe out coral, the Great Barrier Reef, for example, if that disappears, we lose a lot. We lose, what I was just stated there on the Great Barrier Reef. So pretty significant. And so the biggest coral bleaching is mainly because of temperature and CO2. So those are the two main things that are creating that coral bleaching. All right, and then the open ocean. So open ocean is this area here. So we've got same thing kind of with our aquatic or freshwater biome. We've got the photic zone, so that's where you have sunlight penetrating through, and then you've got this aphotic zone. So this is basically where sunlight isn't penetrating through, and that's a majority of the ocean. If you look at the space in the ocean, the majority of the ocean is an aphotic zone. So this area, and then the intertidal area, very small compared to the whole ocean. But there is a lot of life teeming in this aphotic zone. And you've got a variety of different things. You've got these hydrothermal vents. You've got chemosynthesis. So there is not photosynthesis because there's no light, but you've got something called chemosynthesis, which is organisms that are thriving, like these worms here. They're just thriving on these hydrothermal vents. And so there's lots of nutrient rich water that's coming out of this. It's coming from the mantle, and it's basically full of nutrients. And these organisms produce their own energy, but they produce it using the nutrients that are in the water instead of sunlight. And that's happening down here. You can see this aphotic zone down here. And of course, there's still the benthic zone, so that's not changed from our freshwater. So that's just basically the bottom. The difference is that we call this aphotic in the ocean.
The Pacific Ocean, 250 miles off the coast of the Galapagos Islands. In 1977, a deep-sea submarine descended over 8,000 feet. Its mission? To investigate hydrothermal activity on the ocean floor. Marine explorer Robert Ballard was aboard. He detected a dramatic change in the ocean's temperature.
You know, we were not expecting what we found. We were expecting to find water, and we had a camera inside the vehicle, but it was just taking pictures, so we didn't know what we had till we came back. We brought it up to the surface, and we processed the film, and we knew the spot where the temperature spike was, and it was like going to Disneyland. Probably one of the biggest biological discoveries ever made on Earth was made that day.
Ballard and his team were the first to see it, face to face. Hydrothermal vents. Immense chimney-like structures, several stories high, spewing hot water geysers, black with minerals and nutrients. The temperature around these deep-sea vents was a scorching 760 degrees Fahrenheit. And then an astonishing sight. Life, thriving without sunlight, a biological community never seen before. An exotic garden of marine life, species without eyes, others resembling Triassic-era fossils, over 200 million years old.
What we totally were blown away by were these giant tube worms, some of them 8, 9, 10 feet tall. And when you cut them, they bled human-like blood. I mean, when the submarine landed, there was a squish, and red blood came up around all the portholes. And that's how eerie it was. And then to find these extremely unusual creatures living in this oasis, it had no relationship to the normal life of the deep sea. And yet here they were living in this toxic water. But yet these creatures were thriving on it. And then when we dissected, I remember we took one of these clams. When we opened it up in the first place, whew, as soon as we opened it up, it stunk.
It was full of hydrogen sulfur.
Horrible smell.
Rotten eggs.
Yeah, and we opened it up, and then we looked, and it didn't look like, it looked like beef. It was red, bright red. And it didn't have an anatomy of a clam. It was like, what happened to the clam? Someone had taken over its body. And that something was a bacterium. A tiny bacterium that had figured out over eons of time how to duplicate photosynthesis in the dark chemically through a process we now call chemosynthesis. And that was the discovery that there was another life system on Earth that did not go by the book that you and I read, that was not living off the energy of the sun, but was living off the energy of the Earth itself. And that really opens up the ballgame.
I'll say.
And these bacterium, we now think are the largest mass of living things on Earth.
They're in the rocks everywhere.
In the whole mountain range.
Under the
If
ocean.
you added up all the people and all the living things on land and add up all the creatures in the ocean and the few things in the sky, and you got a number, so many tons, there's more tons of biomass. We used to just think, the insects rule the earth. Wrong. These bacterium.
So where are these vents?
All over the earth. Imagine a baseball with a seam on it. That seam begins beneath the polar ice caps, goes down through the Atlantic, into the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific. It runs around the Earth for 42,000 miles. It's the largest feature on Earth, the mid-ocean ridge, and it's underlain by literally tens of thousands of magma chambers.
Is that where life began? In the hot springs?
Well, that's what people are now thinking. The biology books that we were reading have now been thrown away.
Yeah.
And they're writing new ones.
Everything, you had to be on the surface.
That's right. And you had this soup and the lightning bolt hit it and you formed all sorts of amino acids and things like that. But now what we think is that the hydrothermal vents may have been the site of life on Earth. It's also given us a new prospecting tool for searching for it elsewhere with our own solar system. We're now looking at a moon of Jupiter called Europa, which we think has an ocean. We think it has underwater volcanoes, and there should be life down there. The question is, how smart are their clams?
Did hydrothermal vents give birth to the first primitive microbes on Earth? Perhaps. But one thing is certain. Their discovery challenged long-held beliefs about the conditions necessary for creating life. And once life happened, there was no stopping it.
All right, and so if we look at this little thing, this picture here, basically the open ocean, like I said, is this area here, photic zone to the aphotic zone, and that's it. So hopefully you enjoyed Module 13, and I'll see you next time.